Video game hype. We've all seen it in recent years. Games that overpromise and then release unfinished or buggy. It's a trend that seems to only have gotten worse over time. But when it comes to hype, the 90s were probably the most prolific. Everything at the time was bigger, louder, faster. TV and magazine advertising would show off jaw-dropping visuals of games that would sell millions on hype alone. It was all about CGI and SGI. Jurassic Park and Terminator 2 were blockbuster movies with advanced graphics, and one game would look to bring these high-tech graphics and visuals to home computers and consoles for the first time. Rise of the Robots, released in 1994. This fighting game promised to be even better than Street Fighter 2. It promised advanced cybernetic robots in a versus fighting game with enhanced AI that could adjust to your skill level and know if you were spamming repeat buttons. And of course, it promised amazing ray trace visuals of robot sprites and backgrounds with state-of-the-art graphics. Rise of the Robots was deemed a next-generation fighting game and would feature pre-rendered animated intros, cutscenes, and 3D modeled robots, and even the legendary Brian May, the guitarist and songwriter from Queen, to be on the game's soundtrack. The marketing budget spent on this game alone was north of $1 million, and in 1994, this would be unheard of. It would release on just about every single one of the popular home computers and consoles at the time. Here are my copies. I've got the IBM PC version, the Amiga 1200 version, the Sega Mega Drive version, and even the Japanese Super Famicom version. But there were many more ports, including the Amiga CD32, Philips CDI, Panasonic 3DO, Sega Game Gear. Versions were also rumored to be in development for the Sega CD, and even the Atari Jaguar. There was even an arcade version. And not only this, there was merchandise. Here's the book Rise of the Robots, released in 1994. Rise of the Robots was to be the biggest game in history and would release just about everywhere. Even video game magazine publications at the time would fall for the hype, hook, line and sinker. They would be brought into the development offices and shown the game firsthand. They quickly ran back to their offices and penned their articles, calling it a revolution and graphics to die for, putting out multi-page preview spreads of the game and how impressive and how revolutionary it would be. But only a few months later, when the game released, these same magazines would bury the game, calling it an absolute disaster. The public felt cheated. Rise of the Robots was a fairly simple fighting game that looked nice, but totally lacked in the gameplay department. It was boring, stale, and just all-round terrible. Games media had broken the trust of their customers, and it would take years to repair this damage. So how did it all go so bad? To answer that, we need to understand the development of Rise of the Robots and how it came to be, and that story begins in 1991. Andy Wood had already made a name for himself in the British video game industry. His company USD was a marketing firm that was involved in the sales and promotion of many hit games in the 80s and 90s, and it just had won a contract as the European agent for Sierra Online, who at that point were one of the biggest software publishers in North America. This was by all accounts a huge deal. But Andy had other ideas. He wanted to be more involved in the games industry. He had the contacts, and he had his own dreams to become a publishing house. And at the start of 1992, he'd formed a brand new company, Mirage, which was suggested to him by then head of development at Ocean Software, Gary Bracey. With his industry contacts, it wouldn't be long before Mirage published their first two games. The first was Ashes of Empire. The third in the Midwinter series was developed by the legendary developer Mike Singleton. This, by all accounts, was an important get for Mirage, as the Midwinter series was previously published by Microprose, and getting Ashes of Empire under the Mirage label was the work of Peter Jones, who was originally the marketing director at Microprose and left to run the European arm of Sierra Online, but would become quickly frustrated at the direction the company was taking. He also had dreams of disrupting the industry and had the same visions as Andy. He resigned from his job at Sierra to become business partners with Andy's new startup publishing house, and he was able to set up Ashes of Empire as the first game for the label. Ashes of Empire sold well, but Mirage needed more games under their label, and 1992's The Humans was primed to be that game. It was a cartoon-style puzzle game that looked to be the game that was riding on the coattails of Lemmings from Psygnosis that had released a year earlier. Now, The Humans isn't a bad game. It garnered praise for its originality, presentation, and audio, and it was even followed up with 3 sequels. But most of its popularity, either fairly or unfairly, was that it was considered a Lemmings clone. Worse, however, was that early copies of the game would crash on level 13, which gave the publisher a reputation for releasing a buggy and unfinished game. As the publisher, it falls to them, of course, but neither Andy or Peter Jones was satisfied with how Mirage was operating, and they decided it was time that any game developed under Mirage would be developed in-house under their complete control. In 1992, there was no bigger software house in the UK than the Bitmap Brothers. The games were all critically acclaimed, with many #1 hits, and when you bought a Bitmap Brothers game, you knew you were in for a visual and oral treat. The visual style had a certain charm. That distinct metallic and stone aesthetic was really something special, and the music would often feature electronic dance and techno with commercial musicians. The developers had a style about them, often photographed looking like rock stars instead of game programmers. These guys were cool, and as a kid at the time, believe me, I wanted to be like them. The Bitmap Brothers' pioneering legacy remains one of the high points of the UK gaming scene in the late 80s and early 90s. Sean Griffiths, who worked at the Bitmap Brothers during this time, was credited as a programmer on Cadaver and the lead programmer on Magic Pockets, a quirky platform game in the typical Bitmap Brothers style. It reviewed well, but Sean wondered if he could do more. He could see the change in the industry and wanted to be a part of it. In the early 90s, CD-ROM technology was slowly starting to become a standard, and the poor old floppy disk had already hit its limits. At a London CES show in 1991, Sean was demonstrating Magic Pockets right next to the Mindscape booth with Wing Commander on display, and he said to himself, "Obviously, I'm doing something wrong." Computer graphics at the time were advancing at an astronomical rate. Feature movies such as Terminator 2 and Jurassic Park showed off computer-generated dinosaurs and amazing special effects generated by Silicon Graphics workstations. Sean was the lone programmer on Magic Pockets, and he knew if he wanted to make a big game, he would need to put a team together. In early 1992, Street Fighter II was in the arcades, but it was only really starting to grow in popularity, and it hadn't reached the success that it would ultimately become. Sean could see the popularity of the fighting game genre taking off, and decided that his next game would be a fighting game. He saw the emergence of CD-ROM technology and 256 color graphics on screen, and wondered if there was a way to break the limits of the Amiga hardware, which only supported 32 colors and a floppy disk. But Sean had a solution. By using a 3D CAD package like 3D Studio or Real 3D, his idea was to build a fighting game with 3D robotic characters all set in a realistically rendered but futuristic robotic world. And just to pause for a quick moment, this would be 2 years before the release of Donkey Kong Country. With his idea, he resigned from his position at the Bitmap Brothers and searched for a suitable publisher to help fund his game. After months of rejections, it was Andy Wood and Mirage that had hired him. "He's doing something with us, and it's going to be massive," Andy said. Peter Jones was also ecstatic, stating that it was a brilliant concept. With the green light, Sean got to work putting together his team to build the robot fighting game. The team would be known as Instinct Design, and it was mostly composed of people who weren't even game developers at all. Rather, they were people that had computer and design skills. This was intentional, as Sean wanted people who weren't versed in understanding the limitations of 16-bit computers at the time. Instead, he wanted to work with people who knew no limits. The first was Andy Clark, who worked at Mirage providing technical support for Ashes of Empire. However, in his spare time, Andy was a bedroom programmer and had some experience developing his own games that made their way through the Amiga public domain sector. It was his work on Duty, an obvious ripoff of Mario Brothers, that landed him the job. Andy knew Amiga programming well enough, and he started to work on the original Amiga version of Rise of the Robots. The other team members were a bit less conventional, to say the least. Sean Naden was straight out of college and responded to the job advert in PC Gamer magazine and landed himself an interview. When he showed Sean Griffiths his portfolio, he was hired. Sean Naden, however, confessed to have never used a computer, much less a 3D CAD package. This would only be a minor inconvenience to Sean Griffiths, who believed that he was the right man for the job. Gary Leach was also the next team member, after demoing a version of Galaxian that he had developed on his PC. Initially reluctant, Sean Griffiths had doubts about Gary, but after Gary showed him his other game, an impressive clone of the arcade classic Defender, and letting Sean know that he loved Magic Pockets, he was also hired. Quan Lee was an interior designer with no computer skills, but convinced Sean that he was the man for the job. Quan suggested that his real-world experience could very easily be transformed into pixels on the screen. After all, any fighting game needs some interesting backgrounds, and his real-world talents would add that extra dimension to the team. Quan was hired, and the team was set. A small 5-man Instinct design team was ready to take on the world and built their robot masterpiece. The game was storyboarded with a full plot and an introduction sequence to immerse the player into the world. It's 2043 and ElectroCorp is the leading manufacturer of advanced robotics. The role of the player is to assume control of Cyborg in an attempt to stop the supervisor who has developed self-awareness and infected all the other robot droids in the plant, 5 of them to be exact. You must battle your way and neutralize all 5 of these robots and then move on to the final showdown with the supervisor. By the middle of 1993, Rise of the Robots development had started to take form, and it was at this point where Mirage was ready to let the press know what they were working on. Now, for my younger audience, this was long before the days of Twitter and social media. Marketing your video game meant working with specialized computer game magazines at the time. Amiga Format, EGM, GamePro, PC Format, Computer and Video Games, just to name a few. There were many computer game magazines publications from both the UK and the USA, and Mirage understood that they needed to work with them in order to promote this brilliant new fighting game concept. It was of the utmost importance to make a positive impression with the press, otherwise their game may not be stocked in game stores or quickly end up in bargain bins. And for this, Mirage brought in Julia Coombs, an experienced marketing manager who knew the ins and outs of the British computer game industry and would leave her position at Microprose before accepting the job at Mirage. By September 1993, 3D rendering CAD packages and programs like 3D Studio were becoming very popular and interest was at an all-time high. Sean's idea of building a robot fighting game with pre-rendered 3D graphics was unconventional, but also very, very exciting. If he could pull it off, it would be truly a next-generational experience. Julia brought in respected UK games magazines to witness Rise of the Robots firsthand in the Mirage offices for a sneak preview. Reactions were very, very positive. The UK press loved what they saw penning their previews the following month. Almost all of them were extremely positive, with of course a big focus on the graphics, but they would also remind their audience that Sean worked previously for the Bitmap Brothers and was a very skilled programmer. Not only this, many of the articles talked about the advanced AI, as well as the fully 3D environment that told a story more like a movie rather than a conventional fighting game. The hype train had left the station. A whole world has been created for Rise of the Robots. The concept revolves around that of a film rather than a normal game. With a single button, you're going to have 16 different moves, and each of the robots will have about 100 frames of animation. Or how about this one? The game is being developed by our in-house programming team, Instinct Design, which is headed by ex-Bitmap brother Sean Griffiths. We think it'll provide the ultimate combat game for current mainstream markets, and that by using 3D modeling software that produces high-quality ray-trace graphics, it'll be more realistic and animated than ever before. It wouldn't be long before newspapers and television shows would also promote this revolutionary new fighting game, notably Bad Influence, a 1990s British television program broadcast that looked at video games and computer technology mostly aimed for a younger audience who owned 16-bit consoles and computers at the time. The show was a major marketing push for Rise of the Robots, with its opening sequence altered to be based around the game itself. Its December 1993 episode heavily featured the game, with a deep look into how the developers constructed the 3D robot models using a 3D CAD package. The show's host, Violet Berlin, talked about the backgrounds being designed by a professional interior designer and how sophisticated the AI is in the game, claiming that you just can't mash the same button over and over. Most people who are familiar with fighting games understand this to be input reading. This allows the programmer to build responses to the moves the player is inputting during the same frame. The AI in Rise of the Robots would be a key marketing point right there next to the 3D rendered sprites and backgrounds. These would be known as data tables. Computer AI in fighting games is one of the most difficult things to get right. It can make or break a fighting game, and it takes years to perfect. If you look at the iterations of all the Street Fighter II games in that series, you'll know exactly what I mean. The idea behind these AI data tables makes perfect sense. Unfortunately, as we'll find out, the execution of this code during gameplay would be far too easy to exploit. The most well-known preview for the game undoubtedly came from Edge magazine. Known for its no-nonsense insight into the video game industry, the December 1993 edition front cover is infamous, with the player character robot, named Cotton, on the front cover with the words, "Graphics to die for. Who cares about the gameplay when it looks this good? Edge does." A 9-page preview of the game showed us some stunning graphics and a deep dive into just how the small 5-man team managed to pull this off. Much of the talk was also about the revolutionary AI. It's not a conventional beat 'em up. We're using a lot of artificial intelligence, and we'll definitely have one up over Street Fighter II, claimed Sean Griffiths. Gary Leach, who was the head of development on the PC version and according to Edge magazine, was also a martial arts expert who perfected the fighting movements. It was a mouth-watering prospect for Amiga and PC gamers at the time. It has gameplay that has never been seen before and graphics that have never been seen before. It's the true next generation, boasted Julia Coombs. Almost all of the magazines praised the game in their previews. All, that is, except for one, Amiga Power, who in their preview admitted that they couldn't really praise the game on its merits simply because they hadn't seen a playable version of the game yet. And this would be where the first signs of trouble would appear for Andy and Peter back at the Mirage offices. The amount of money being spent on the game's marketing was ballooning, and its return on investment would simply not reach its full potential. You see, the Amiga and PC markets were limited. Projected sales were at £50 million at launch, but Mirage knew that the computer games market wouldn't be enough. They needed to tap into the lucrative console space and noted that the Mortal Kombat home versions developed by Acclaim released simultaneously on just about every console and computer on the same day, known as Mortal Monday, in September of 1993. Mirage, however, was only a small operation. They didn't have the resources or money to foot the bill for the console ports, especially for the Sega Genesis and Super NES, which had very strict licensing guidelines. Game cartridges need to be paid for in advance, and development kit hardware was to be used, which is very expensive. But undeterred, Mirage struck a deal with Time Warner Interactive in the USA and offered them the publishing rights for the game on all major consoles, including the Super NES, Sega Genesis, Panasonic 3DO, Sega Game Gear, Philips CDI, even the Atari Jaguar and Sega CD. A book deal was also finalized, and an arcade machine was also in development. And then there was Brian May. He would be brought in when Mirage were able to get in touch with his management after months of trying to reach out when Andy Wood went to see the famous guitar player in concert in 1993. The idea to get Brian May on Rise of the Robots all sounds pretty good, right? He would compose the music for the game. But the song featured in the game, known as The Dark, wasn't actually written for Rise of the Robots at all. And other than the 3DO and PC Collector's Edition, most of the versions available would only have a few chords of the song at the very beginning of the game. The Amiga and PC versions both released at the end of 1994, and it was quickly obvious that something horribly wrong had occurred. The A500 version came on a massive 10 discs, The A1200 version was even larger, spanning 13. The animated intro alone would use up a single disc, and playing through the game was a painful experience with countless disc swapping. While more Amiga users were using hard drives by this point, many, especially those who owned Amiga 500s, simply weren't, and this was not ideal. Now, you could forgive the number of discs if there was a good game here, but sadly there wasn't. Simply put, we were lied to. Edge magazine. Yes, the very same Edge magazine that hyped up the game beyond belief 1 year before, gave Rise of the Robots a 2 out of 10, calling it truly awful. And remember Amiga Power, the only magazine that threw caution into the wind during the previews? They would give it a 5 out of 100. No, that's not an error. We're talking about 5%. Other than the nice graphics, they also called the game terrible. Other reviews were less harsh perhaps, but the overall score of Rise of the Robots sat at around a 5 out of 10. So what exactly went wrong? Well, just about everything. The game was simply too repetitive and boring to play. The animated intro sequence was all here in its glory on the Amiga, and it's definitely worth a look. But the problem is, once you've seen it a few times, it's easier just to skip it, because you'll be swapping discs like a madman as you play through the game. The sophisticated AI can easily be exploited by trapping your opponent into a corner and doing a forward high jump kick over and over until you beat the game. You could do this on the game's easier difficulties. Things do get a little more challenging if you play them on medium or hard mode, but no matter what difficulty setting you're on, there's barely any challenge here. The original Amiga version also has no music at all during the stages. Instead, it contains ambient sounds of industrial robot machinery and the low hum of large fans. There was an Amiga CD32 version, and for all intents and purposes was identical to the A1200 version, except there would be no disc swapping. The PC version fares a little better, with sharper graphics and colors, but overall has the same core issues as the Amiga version. The console versions are a little more interesting. The Sega Genesis, Super NES, and Game Gear ports were all handled by Data Design Incorporated. Originally planned for a Christmas of 1994 release, the Genesis version was delayed to February of 1995 due to fundamental flaws in the gameplay and tightening up the graphics on level 3. When it showed up, finally at the end of 1994, it was one of the better versions of the game, but that's not really saying much. It has some nice animations with the Mode 7 style foreground movement, and it even had in-game music, which was composed not by Brian May, but by the late Richard Joseph. The Genesis version has a reduced color palette, but just like the Amiga version, it's fundamentally flawed in the gameplay department, which is a common theme. The Super Nintendo version is far more colorful than the Genesis version, with a nicer looking color palette and pretty decent graphics. The in-game music, once again composed by Richard Joseph, is pretty good. But again, it's just far too easy to mash the same button over and over and win. Those AI data tables simply has no answer for this. The Sega Game Gear would also see a port, and it's bad. Real bad. There's really nothing good that you can take away from this game. It has terrible controls, the gameplay is as good as the other versions, and the animations are particularly choppy. It does have an animated background, however, but it really is just more of a distraction than anything else. GamePro magazine was particularly critical of the game, calling it boring, basic, limited, and the choppy animations make the player feel disconnected from what is actually happening on screen. The Panasonic 3DO version was published by Art Data Interactive and developed by Mirage and Cognizance, with the programmer Keith Wood claiming no version will sound or play better than ours. Rise is the type of title which really confirms 3DO as a major player. Now, Keith wasn't exactly incorrect. The port itself does look nice with no compromises on the FMV and the graphics, but then again, the gameplay is just awful, maybe the worst of all of them. And I should pause here to mention that another major issue with Rise of the Robots here is that the animations for different light and heavy attacks look identical. You never quite know what kind of move you're making. And then there's the boot sequence. Press B for Brian May. I mean, what are we doing here? The 3DO version has far and away the most Brian May of any of the versions, so if you are a Queen fan, it may be worth taking a look. Otherwise, it's the exact same formula as the Amiga and PC versions. Electronic Gaming Monthly completely destroyed the game in their review, calling it by far the worst fighting game I've ever seen. Overlong cinematics, a severely limited number of moves, difficulty pulling off even basic punches and kicks, and long load times. The Philips CDI version is more or less a port of the 3DO version, but it's a little more sluggish, and there's really not much else to say about this one. Sorry, Audi. Atari Jaguar CD and Sega CD versions were ultimately cancelled, but not before a work-in-progress trailer of the Sega CD version was presented. Just sit back and listen to this.
It's futuristic battle action and strategy as never before. Gamers play the role of a cyborg and take on droids in order of their technical sophistication. In a cinematic 3D arena with full 360-degree freedom of movement, Rise of the Robots features fighting moves conceived by a martial arts expert and VR-inspired backgrounds designed by an architect. It's the first combat game to use artificial intelligence for advanced fighter complexity. Opponents.
The first combat game to feature artificial intelligence, proven in focus groups, moves designed by a martial arts expert. It's hard to imagine that Gary Leach, the head programmer for the PC version, really wanted to attach his name for this piece of marketing. But this claim was just about everywhere. It was in the previews, it was also even on the back of the box as a major selling point. And then there's the arcade version. With Andy and Peter's connections in the industry, they struck a deal with Bellfruit, who were looking to work with some game publishers to bring popular computer games to the arcade. Bellfruit would have prototypes of Zool and Rise of the Robots in development, and they ran on a platform known as Raster Speed. At its core, it's a 486 PC-based architecture, but does use a TI DSP for sound and an FPGA-based custom accelerator card. Rise of the Robots in the arcade was effectively a port of the PC CD-ROM version, and the cabinet came with a built-in hard drive to fit the entire game. Now, this version is a lot more interesting than the home computer versions because it does away with the story-based gameplay where you can only play as the cyborg robot. Instead, the arcade version has all robots playable in single-player mode. The full motion video and graphics are also enhanced and it looks quite good. But the arcade game would never be released, and essentially the gameplay is the same here as the home ports. It didn't have that balancing that's required to make those arcade experiences compelling. You can easily beat the game with a crusher droid and just mash buttons and get to the last stage. The game is a passing curiosity, but it's also fully playable in MAME if you want to take a look for yourself. Rise of the Robots was a failure, and the media had overhyped the game so much that even some were forced to apologize. The Edge magazine retrospective of Rise of the Robots in 2001, they said, when Edge previewed the game with its now legendary graphics to die for cover, expectations were genuinely high. Sadly, it transpired this material was mostly a work of fiction, embellished with PR spin. Edge was in fact duped. When Rise eventually appeared a flawed, uninspired, unfinished non-game, the score was duly dismal, but Rise of the Robots remains an albatross around the neck of Edge. Next Generation 1998's retrospective on the failure of Rise of the Robots was a little more pointed. Most gamers now know not to trust packaging graphics, but this was a lesson that had to be learned the hard way. In hindsight, it's obvious that nothing could look that good and simultaneously offer great gameplay, but back in 1994, no one was aware that such high-resolution rendered graphics came with such a price tag, and no one was expecting the game to fail. Mirage managing director Peter Jones had a different take. To criticize something is easy. To praise something is very difficult. You must look at Rise of the Robots in context. At the time, there wasn't a PC market. There was no CD-ROM market. It was all new. I think Rise of the Robots has to be seen as a product of its time. Bruised and battered but not defeated, Rise of the Robots, with its many ports on almost every platform, ended up selling quite well all said and done. Of course, much of this was due to hype, misleading marketing and lies. But it wouldn't be quite the end of the story. In 1996, the sequel Rise 2 Resurrection released on the PC, PlayStation and Sega Saturn. It was an improvement over the original, and perhaps the game that Sean Griffiths was looking to build from the beginning. Most of the magazines reviewed the game poorly, maybe getting one back at the studio for feeling duped, as Edge magazine put it, or maybe they didn't want to fall for the same trick twice. It's hard to say, but overall, Rise 2 is a better effort. Unfortunately though, by this point, PlayStation and Saturn were enjoying games like Virtua Fighter 2, Tekken 3 and Dead or Alive, not to mention the peak of 2D games from the Street Fighter Alpha series. Rise 2 still somehow had Brian May as well. This time around, featuring an all-original song just for the game called Cyborg. It's not a bad game really, and it does unfairly get bundled in to the mistakes of the original. Mirage would ultimately close their doors in 1999 after their last game, Actual Pull, was released for the PlayStation. In the end, Rise of the Robots failed for many reasons, but ultimately it just wasn't a good game. The idea and concept around it was quite compelling, but the game itself was soulless, with a single robot character to control against other generic name robots such as Primate, Loader, Crusher, Supervisor. What made Street Fighter II and Mortal Kombat so great was each character was playable, and they all had an identity and a story behind them. When I first experienced Street Fighter II on the SNES, I played through every single character to learn what happened to their fate at the end of the game. I wanted to know what happened when you beat Goro in Mortal Kombat, and why Shang Tsung could morph into just about every other character. Rise of the Robots also missed out on one of the most important ingredients: gameplay. The developers obviously worked hard given the heavy crunch to get the game to market, but ultimately the game ended up being an expensive tech demo. Much of the blame also has to fall on the magazines. They misled the public without question. They were too caught up in the moment, and it was their job to responsibly report on the game, on its merits. And while I want to tell you that this story of Rise of the Robots wouldn't happen again, we've seen it over and over in the history of the video game industry. The difference nowadays is that games can be patched over time to address these issues. Games such as No Man's Sky, Watch Dogs, Anthem, and even Cyberpunk 2077 come to mind. Mirage didn't have that luxury back in 1994, and Peter Jones was probably right. Rise of the Robots was simply a product of its time. Bye for now.
I'm gonna